So Ben, you're well known for your puns. Do you have any testing or software related puns for us today?
Actually,
We're
I
gonna
don't
allow
have
it.
one,
Okay.
but I think that's too bad. I guess Git happens.
Okay. Okay. Maybe I'll give that a 4 out of 5.
Four or
Yeah.
five. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
that's a compliment. Thanks.
Hello, welcome to Tarik Talks. My name is Sabrina, and this is a Malaysian podcast about the people behind our country's tech ecosystem. So today we have Ben. Ben, he is he's a backend engineer. He designs and manages backend systems for content delivery services. But today, what we would like to learn from you is we want to learn about how do we design and evaluate good tests. We are going to explore some open source frameworks as well. If you're interested, come and join us. So Ben, you work as a software engineer and you design and manage content delivery services. So, but I know that you've also dabbled in performance testing before. So can you share with us, like, where does testing come in for you? Is it part of the shift left testing approach, or from which angle do you go about testing?
Yeah. So just a bit of background of essentially how I started on testing is I started off testing back then on my first role, which I was working as a test automation engineer. So from there, I worked with functional testing, which essentially means that you want to check whether the app works correctly, maybe the button is working fine, the input is working correctly, etc. And also, I learned about performance testing back then in my first role in testing. So, not just on the work basis, but also these are certification as well. So, if you are interested in testing, there are many certifications out there that are relevant. Maybe you can look into sites like from CTFL that gives you a foundation in testing as well. So, yeah, so from there, I did quite a number of testing within the payments domain, but I have not really looked into performance testing until my recent role, in which I essentially work as a backend engineer. And from there, what happened was there was a lot of applications that require performance testing. So my role there, using my expertise as well in testing, um, essentially what I did was to build tools that are useful for performance testing. So that's how one of my projects, which is a open source framework for performance testing, came about. Yeah.
And I take it that you also work with QA teams as well, right? So how does the backend engineering team work with a QA team? What's kind of a workflow that has worked from your experience?
So I can look into this in two perspectives. One is back then when I was a QA, and also now as a senior backend engineer,
Yeah.
leading the backend services. So essentially, in both is we work together as a technical team, and also there's product teams that come in and we discuss requirements, etc. So once we have the necessary requirements, we would essentially use that requirement to do or build the things that we need to do. So, for example, on the QA perspective, we will gather the requirements and build the necessary test cases and test plans. In which back then I was working with my QA lead to come up with the necessary testing testing test plans, etc. On the perspective of a developer, obviously we'll be gather the requirements and then I'll build the application from there. So, but essentially once we have these requirements and the things that we build, we can essentially our build what we need to do at the same time. So it's similar to how we would call agile methodology, like a sprint, right? So essentially, um, that's how we work together in a way where the QA will check with the developers whether the feature is ready for testing, and vice versa. The developer will check with the QA whether there's any bugs on the testing. So I would say that both parties need to work together closely. Yeah.
And do you also think that when you work as an engineer, but having that testing experience before kind of make you a better developer?
So yeah, and on the perspective of being a senior software engineer coming from a QA background, it definitely helped me to be a better backend engineer actually. So here's a hot take.
Okay.
I think as a fresh grad back then, being a tester helped me a lot in understanding software. In the way where, as someone that deals with testing, you will want to look into the big picture of the application and test probably the end-to-end flow, right? So over there, especially for me, I actually came from a mechanical engineering background, so I didn't really
Same.
dabble with software. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so I didn't really dabble with software, but being able to see on a holistic picture or like the big picture of how a software engineering application or basically a software works gives me like a better idea of what can go wrong or where can be improved. So when I became a backend engineer, where typically backend engineers look into a certain domain within that system, yeah, so I would build the application, but I also, on the back of my head, I would have thought about what might go wrong, and also at the same time, make the application much more testable. Meaning to say, like I will create mocks or data that is able to help in the testing itself. Yeah, so I would say that it helps in a way. It helps a lot actually. Yeah.
That's good because then you get to design and better test too, I would say.
Yeah.
You're currently working in media, though you have previously worked in payments as well. I'm curious to know whether you see any similarities or differences in these industries, whether that's in terms of the high volume applications or the way testing is viewed or even the work experience itself.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely similarities in both systems. I think the main goal is to make sure that, like both applications are essentially very high traffic, but they need to work exactly like how it's supposed to serve everyone,
Yeah.
right, that uses the system. So, uh, yeah, so that's like the general idea the general goal when it comes to performance testing. But in the same time, also, there are definitely differences because both essentially have different infrastructures, different systems in general. So and different use cases. So like payments, you want to make sure money transfers securely and efficiently, and also have low latency, etc. from one party to another party, and you want to make sure that the money doesn't like stops at any one of the parties, so it's like it'll become a bottleneck. So yeah, and you can see that one of the bigger issue that can happen, or like one of the bigger things that we want to test in performance testing in payments is, say, during like big sales like Shopee 11 sales, so the spike can be really really high.
Yeah.
Similar to media as well, but media is more towards like making sure we aggregate the content to millions of users at a time. So say like the finals of FIFA World Cup, where there's a lot of people watching, millions, can be billions also. So you want to make sure that the content is served like real time to everyone, almost real time.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if like right before a goal and
I
the stream
know.
cuts? Yeah. So that can happen. So that's one of the goals of performance testing. We want to make sure that all these possible anomalies can be identified early, and we will simulate all possible scenarios. Yeah.
Related to that, I guess now I want to zoom in a little bit on the testing. So you've recently shared an open source testing framework that you have created. And it's very unique in its own way as well, where it can simulate varying patterns, which is kind of useful for things that might have custom spikes or any custom patterns. So, which is also useful for the system that you mentioned earlier, right? Because they have, you might have a spike on certain shopping days. So, what was the thought process behind this framework? And say, how does it differ to say JMeter or Locus, etc.?
Yeah, so just to give a brief explanation or introduction to that open source tool. So I essentially use K6 as a script to write my load test requirements or performance test requirements. Then also the data that from the K6 script will be streamed to a time series database called InfluxDB, in which having the data in the InfluxDB allows us to visualize it through dashboard like Grafana. So these three work together quite well in that way. But the open source tool, what the issue that we want to identify is that users are not able to, or users of a load testing tool are not able to scale the load required, in the sense that, say you want even more load, but your server is limited to a certain throughput of that load or traffic, right? So so to combat that, I also integrated with Ansible, so we can actually orchestrate multiple load generators to deliver the load that we need for the application. So it's essentially a load test tool, but like you are able to spawn many of them to multiply the number of load that you want. Yeah. So the reason why I prefer K6, and I actually always prefer K6,
Okay.
mainly because
Tell
I'm
us
much more
more.
of a I'm much more of like a programmatical script kind of guy rather than a UI guy. So um, the one of the reason is mainly because one, I don't really like to dabble with UI, but also at the same time, like when you do a performance test, there can be complex business logics applied. So maybe like, say if you want to do shopping, right? You will add to cart, you log in, add to cart, make payment, etc. So there's many API calls in which, if you want to use JMeter, you probably need to have a custom module for that, and also probably need to have a custom UI for that. So it's like there's a lot more things to figure out, and it's hard. I would say it's a bit cumbersome, especially if there's other people that need to work on it. Could be hard to manage the UI. So yeah, it's essentially, I just like non-UI stuff in this scenario.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess it's like what you said also, it's easier because you don't need to customize so many things,
Yep.
right? So when it comes to designing good tests or evaluating good tests, what do you think is important, and what have you seen that people miss out sometimes?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, first we need to establish the requirements for that certain feature or application, and from there the testers or the people that work on the testing features can essentially build the test plan, the test cases, etc. So for me, when it comes to, say, functional tests, I would always use something called a BDD, which is behavioral driven
Development?
development. Yes, development. Yeah, I'm trying to think of that word. So using BDD is like we try to simulate what the user would be able to click on it, or different possible user flows, so that we can actually like come up with the test cases in a way where it's meaningful. And then but there's also another approach, which is called the TDD, so test driven development,
Okay.
in which you will check every feature of the application, which might or might not be applicable, because some features might not be accessible by the user, which can be, I would consider, sometimes it can be a bit excessive testing. But these are two different approaches that we would typically be exposed to when we are in the testing domain. So so that's on the functional side. For the performance testing side, the methodological approach, I would say, is to make sure that first we need to make sure that we have we collect enough metrics required for the testing.
Yeah.
So say we are able to have a stable testing tool in which we can fire the set amount of loads that we want. But at the same time, also we need to make sure that that testing tool is able to catch metrics such as, say, response time, error rates, and any other possible metrics related to the performance. And also in the same time, also the other approach, the other thing that we need to probably do is to be able to to be able to monitor different aspects of the application as well. So on the application side, we might want to have visualization on how the database performs, how the caching performs, the RAM, CPU, etc. So this this is pretty much required when it comes to performance testing. Yeah.
And this is what you also observe as you trigger the test and then you will monitor all
Correct.
of these, right?
Yeah.
I remember that you shared or you posted this one photo of you with like 6 windows open and then you had at least 4 of them were Grafana. And then, so when we have all of these metrics, right, how do we surface what actually matters? Like, how do you know whether something is just noise or something is an anomaly? How do you handle that and actually get what is useful?
Yeah. So to know what's anomaly, we first need to know what's the normal first. So to know what the normal is essentially to know how much load to trigger or how is the load pattern that we want. So for example, I think the easiest example is say at a very high load, we need the application to sustain it. So for me, I would typically uh, go, for example, if I'm trying to hit the peak, I would go for, say, a load at the peak plus another 40% overhead. So the 40% is I would consider some sort of rule of thumb that people might set, but it differs per domain. So maybe in payments you want to go 100% headroom, so it sustains well. But essentially these numbers are taken from, say, if you have a historical data, you would use that as a benchmark to get your peak load, and then maybe an extra headroom so that the application can survive before, say, any form of auto scaling. And the other part is to say if it's a new application, you want to look into the maybe research the market first and get like a good number, maybe like a much higher number. So because I think mainly because you don't know, you can't expect what's the final
You
load
don't
to
know
be.
what the base is.
Yeah,
Like.
you don't know what the base is, and you can go overhead, and then like over time, maybe a few months down the road, you can reduce it to optimize your resources, etc. Right. So that's to define the normal. So when you do performance tests, you can see probably some anomalies, but say and the anomalies can come from two parties. One would be the testing tool, where it might not be stable. The load that it fires fluctuates a lot. Maybe on the application side, which is the real problem that you want to look at. But usually, when it comes to performance testing, one run itself is not sufficient to know whether things are broken. It could be just certain settings or configurations. So we can't really understand. We can't really take that as like a final issue that we have. So, but the idea would be to obviously to make the test tool to be stable first, and fire the load consistently across. So meaning to say, like, over multiple runs, you want to make sure the test tool fires consistently across to the application. And from there, on the application side, that's how we want to have multiple metrics or different ways to check what could go wrong. And maybe it could be a DB slow query or like a caching issue that is not established well. Yeah. So so essentially when it comes to anomalies, you want to be able to run the load test consistently across multiple runs, and from there you're able to identify easier.
So I guess to get your baseline, you kind of need repeatable results first to
Yep.
ensure that, okay, this is something that I can trust.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. I want to learn a little bit more, or we'll go back to the open source framework that you've created. I think that it's really nice now that it's really nice that you have created this and then you've shared it for a lot of people to use, and they get to use it, they get to share their feedback as well, so that ultimately we get something a bit better. And it's also quite nice now that you see more and more people sharing their work, either that's on GitHub or on Medium. Even our data.gov.my has a GitHub account.
Okay.
Yeah, it's for the public open data sector program. So I think, how do you encourage people to either contribute to open source, or if someone is a little bit scared, or they don't know where to start, where should they begin?
Yeah, been there, done that. Always looking at open. I mean, like personally, also I look at open source tools and I'm like, am I the right person to add changes? Like, like have that imposter syndrome in me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think in general is first, if you see open source project that you like, first of all, use it first, right? And use it and just use it, play around with it, and if you see any issues like or any things that you can improve from there, or then it could just be something small. Like you could obviously start small, and that would be the advice that I would want to share as well. So probably to start small, it could be maybe just a small change on the documentation, uh, or maybe just a small feature request that you see could help. So from there, you kind of also learn how to like create a PR to approach the open source creators to improve things. So over time, when you have used enough open source tools, you'll probably be more familiar with the process that needs to happen. But yeah, that's if you want to change or improve an open source tool. But also there are times where you find a certain project that's really interesting and you want to open source them. So similarly to how I open source my orchestrated testing tool, um, the advice is first obviously to do something that you are interested in, and then eventually like you see, this is impactful, I want to open source it, and yeah, and get a community to work on that. So I would say that if you find it interesting, there are definitely other people that find it interesting as well, and from there you can work together, collaborate, and learn from building that certain open source tool. So to me, at the end of the day, open source tools are essentially the big goal is to like go is for it to like be really big and help a lot of people in the community. But I would say the another bigger part of it is that you get to learn together and collaborate with people of similar interests and mindset. Yeah.
That's nice. You get to form like a community as well
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
way. So Ben, you've also built BenCoin, which is essentially a crypto simulator using Go and Vue JS. So I see a pattern here where you kind of build simulators and then you share it out with people to use. So is that a deliberate philosophy or that kind of just came about?
Yeah, I think personally I have multiple projects on my GitHub repo that I share to public as well. So um, it depends on the projects that I create, but there are multiple teams, not just simulators, but also essentially projects that I think um, could bring impact and probably something that matter. But essentially, what it is that these projects interest me, not just building impact, but also to my own learning. So, say in the context of BenCoin, I wanted to build something using Golang, which is my favorite language, learn a bit of front end on Vue, and also learn how to deploy application on Fly.io and also Vercel. So, but essentially is to keep myself motivated to use these applications, I need to build something that intrigues me or interests me. And at that point of time, is cryptocurrency, in which I don't have a lot of experience and also knowledge about it, but I thought that it would make sense for me to build something. And the idea behind it was also because I realized that there is not a lot of simulators that I can use to simulate cryptocurrency. And instead of me using my own money to simulate the crypto experience, yeah, it'd be better for me to build a simulator that has good explanations on how it works, and also you could do hands-on experience on that site as well. And what's cool about the site is you can have multiple people from different part of the world to use that simulated cryptocurrency rail to like exchange money to each other. Yeah, it's not just for you your own experience. Yeah, so yeah, so that aside, it's just essentially the advice that I would share is that there are different tools that you want to learn, but I think the best way to keep yourself motivated to build that thing all the way to the end is to do something that you're interested in. Yeah. So you don't have to follow the status quo, or I have to build like a notepad app. Yeah. You don't have to. Yeah. Just do something that you find
That you
interesting.
like, that you actually
Yeah.
use. I also like your point about starting it with a tool that you like you like Golang, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. With that, thank you very much, Ben, for your time. I've
Thank
learned
you.
about, how we should evaluate metrics, because I think that's important. Like we test, but then how do we actually use it? And then also, I think it's nice how you have built all of these things and share it for people to use as well. And it's good to start. Okay. Anything else that you want to share?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here. If you have some time, check out my projects.
Yeah, check out
But
Ben's project.
but yeah, so yeah, thanks so much for having me here. It's been a really great time.
Right. Thank you very much, Ben. That's it. Thank you. This is
Bye.
Tech Tarik Talks, and this episode is recorded by Ziad Zarin and Larry Lim. Larry and Ziad, you guys want to say bye?
Bye.